Hello to everybody, welcome. This is a very exceptional occasion when we have here Professor Mary E. Lovely. It's not usual to have such an international expert in all our fields, because she's expert in all the fields that we try to develop, promote, and teach at ESCI-UPF. She's expert in logistics, she's expert in international strategy, she's expert in international economics, broadly speaking international economics, but with many of these other aspects, as you will see today. It's, we are very thankful to the US Consulate in Barcelona to provide us with insight that Professor Lovely was here a couple of days and she would be willing to give a lecture. We were approaching, thanks to Joan Pere Plaza. Professor Plaza has been fundamental. We were approaching the consulate in order to have a bit more of interaction, and one of the outcomes has been this one. We hope that there will be others, but this one is such a wonderful start that we are extremely happy with this. Professor Lovely is the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I invite you to browse a bit to realize what the Peterson Institute for International Economics is. When we talk about think tanks, this is a think tank, big think tank in capital letters. It earned the prize to the best think tank for 2020. And the list of the legislation and the agreements that the Peterson Institute has influenced in passing them, it's just impressive. It's the current world. It's the current world has been framed in many ways by their initiative. She served at the Peterson Institute for International Economics as the 2022 Carnegie Chair in US-China relations, US-China. So that's the core of the world trade. Within the Klug Center at the Library of Congress. Professor Lovely is Emeritus of Economics at the Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where she was Melvin A. Eager's Economics Faculty Scholar from 2010 to April 2022. But she had also a longer biography within the university and the school. She was the co-editor of the China Economic Review from 2011 to 2015. Her current research projects investigate the effect of China's foreign direct investment policies on trade flows and entry mode, strategic reform on US tariffs on China, and recent movements in global supply chains. All these are issues that you are studying. Professor Lovely earned, and this is a hint for the young people, earned her PhD in economics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Harvard University. So you can change your mind at some stage when you're still young. So that's a hint for you. And she will be talking today about building more resilient supply chains. That's what we are talking about most of the time. So thank you very much, Professor Lovely.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I guess it's class, so you have to be here, is that right? But we'll try to make it interesting. My topic is building more resilient supply chains. It's on the minds of everyone. You're studying, I think you are the future. You are the people who are going to have to build the more resilient supply chains. My son has a Bachelor of Science in Economics, and he's searching for meaning. He's been working in logistics as a global customs analyst, and I said, there's a lot of meaning in what's going on today in supply chains. And I see that you've already gotten the message, and I congratulate you, because I think you're studying a field. There are so many possibilities for your career, so many opportunities to do well and do good for the world. I know that that's very important to today's students, and I hope to explain why. So I'm going to be talking about building more resilient supply chains, but I don't want to pretend that we know everything. We don't. We're in a new, I almost called it in the new era, which is a little inside joke about China, which is called in the new era. But we are in the new era because ERA, sorry, I have a little bit of a regional accent, because things seem to have changed dramatically. I taught international trade and economics for many, many years. And the things we're thinking about today, we simply didn't think about and teach about. Some of the lessons that we thought we knew, we thought that were well received, are now being questioned, even tossed away into the dustbin. So it is very much a changing world, and we need to try to find a way to move forward peacefully, with security, but also efficiently, a word that's become a little bit of a dirty word lately. And yet we all know that one of your tasks is going to be to create modern, efficient supply chains that meet the requirements for the new era. Okay. Now, just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. What are supply chains and what is meant by resilience? This will be very familiar to you, so I'll spend just one slide. Then I want to talk about why and how do we want to increase resilience. And then I'm going to talk about the Biden administration's approach to building resilience. What is the United States doing? Sometimes it's hard to look at all the pieces and put it together and see a strategy. I think there is an emerging strategy. It's one where we can still contribute to trying to get it right, to create a better, more resilient supply chain. Then I want to return to the ideas that we've had about globalization. And I said, when everything is connected, there's traction in the wheels. When we think about building a resilient supply chain, we face many, many, many constraints and challenges. And I want to talk about how those impinge on the Biden administration's approach. And then last, just speculate a little bit about where do we go from here, and hopefully that can take us right into some discussion. Okay, what are supply chains and what is meant by resilience? Well, we know what supply chains are. Global supply chains are complex networks of manufacturers, suppliers, warehouses, distributors, and shippers who move products and services from one location to another. Seems very straightforward, doesn't it? Except think about how many actors there are as goods move from point A to point B. One of my son's jobs was to facilitate the movement of trade, particularly from Asia and most importantly from China, from the West Coast to the East Coast. He would have maybe 13 different screens with customs forms, regulatory forms, costs, shippers, multimodal on his computer at any one time. And he said to me, "Mom, I had no idea that it took this much effort to get Christmas toys under the tree." That's when I knew that he was growing up, right? Now, these direct activities are orchestrated by a very complex set of flows of blueprints, technology, people, and data across multiple countries and organizations. And of course, underlying all that are government regulations and international treaties, et cetera, that have made these flows possible over time. These flows were not possible when I was born. They have developed, bloomed, blossomed, exploded. Where will they be when you're my age? That's a good question. That's what we want to ask. Now, according to the World Trade Organization, before the pandemic, more than 2/3 of world trade occurred through supply chains that crossed, in which production crossed at least one border, production sharing, and oftentimes more. The technical definition of a global value chain is when a good is produced by crossing borders more than one time, right? 2 or more times. And we know that the development of GVCs, or global value chains, has been an important story over the last 20 to 30 years. And in particular, that it's been important to developing countries who seek to emulate China's growth rate. And have begun to pursue policies, including the development of their human capital, their infrastructure, improvements in their logistics, to take advantage of the growth opportunities that hooking into global value chains can take. This was an important aspect of what we've what's called the Doha round of the WTO. You may know that one function of the World Trade Organization is to negotiate trade agreements. And the last round failed. It was called the Doha round. It was meant to be a development round. If we look back at the websites that came at that period, they talked a lot about technology transfer from the rich north to the developing south. They talked about the value of global value chains. It's interesting to look today and think about technology transfer is now considered more of a dirty words. And we don't really think so much about the value of GVCs. Developing countries are still thinking about that. And in fact, I think the United States is trying to harvest that desire for growth through global markets by negotiating or starting to negotiate things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Unfortunately, as we'll talk about, there's a lot of constraints that the US faces in trying to create these so-called groups of friends or clubs, as it's more familiarly termed in Europe. Now, GBCs, global value chains, are valuable, and they're also vulnerable. And this is where we start to think about resilience. Why are they valuable? Well, they allow for a high degree of specialization according to comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is usually the second chapter, right after the introduction in your international economics textbooks. Comparative advantage tells us that we should assign responsibilities according to who has the lowest relative costs. And those advantages may come from differences in endowments, differences in technology, may come from scale. We have lots of different reasons why relative costs may differ, but GVCs have allowed us to take advantage of that to a degree that we didn't think was possible. You know, when we look back before a lot of fragmentation took place, so right after, say, World War II, we had a lot of trade, growth of trade, not so much on, it was much more controls on capital movements, but countries basically produced a good from start to finish. Now it's rare, much rarer, that a company doesn't use an imported intermediate or isn't selling to a foreign country. And that the production process for many goods is divided into a number of steps. So a country may produce semiconductor, but that semiconductor is somewhere else for packaging. So even something as simple as testing and packaging goes to another country. And that country may be thousands of miles away. So this is fragmented. Why is that happening? Because there's a huge cost advantage to doing so, even given the transportation costs. Now, the cost advantages also flow from the fact that suppliers are allowed to achieve scale. So when we think particularly of China, we think about the enormous scale that China is capable of taking advantage of, both because it's a large country, lots of workers, but also because lots of suppliers go there and create whole cities based on one particular industry. And that allows them to take advantage of so-called agglomeration economies or scale economies that lower costs, and to make it difficult for suppliers outside of China to find other places where they can get the same value and experience. That's another thing. Scale doesn't just happen with size, it happens over time. And Chinese subcontractors have become incredibly adept at working with Western suppliers in terms of product design and meeting the requirements for just-in-time delivery. So we have this deeper relationships that have built between suppliers and the designers of products. And this has allowed developing countries to enter into very complex supply chains. So if we look at China's trade and classify it by, say, resource-based, low-skill, medium-skill, high-skill, we see that China has an enormous amount of trade in the so-called high-skill basket. And this would be your computers, laptops, cell phones, pharmaceuticals. And a lot of that is using knowledge that has been developed elsewhere. But they are able to grab the more labor-intensive aspects of these high-tech goods. That, of course, is changing as China has developed its own capacity in terms of research and development, has begun to move up the value chain, something that we in America actually worry about a lot, right? China's increasing technological capacity, but that China celebrates and seeks to create more of. So this global value chains allow developing countries to enter into value streams that they would not be able to enter into otherwise, and also allows them then to begin to develop the knowledge to move up the value chain, to increase the value added and the wages of the people who work there. Now, GVCs are valuable, I said, both for in terms of reducing prices and increasing the variety of goods that are available. Can you imagine an iPhone without China or without offshoring? Pretty hard to imagine. We could have it. iPhone costs what, $1,000, $800? Sometimes if you update your plan, you can get one for free, right? Free, built into your costs. But you can't imagine what it would be like if they paid wages of, say, $15 to $20 an hour, plus benefits, plus Social Security, plus, right? One thing we know for sure, Apple's profits would not be as high, right? So that is the magic that has happened. It's allowed us to enjoy lower prices, more variety, explosion in IT that would be slowed down because the cost of adoption would have been higher. But GVCs are also very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to domestic disruptions. So we saw, for example, when there was Fukushima disaster in Japan, that it hit industries that were heavily concentrated that. In fact, it's well known that there was many companies, most auto companies couldn't build a particular type of black car because it turned out that all the black paint that these uncoordinated individual actors were purchasing came from one factory. So, it's not, so a disaster that hits one place can have global ramifications. Obviously, the pandemic, we were worried when China experienced the pandemic, and at the end of 2019 into the first part of 2020, and it took out whole cities that specialized heavily in one particular sector or another. So whether pandemics, these can knock individual companies offline. Individual sectors. Now, there's also trans-border disruptions. We're seeing this now with the Houthi youth who are using anti-aircraft missiles to hit ships in the Red Sea. That's a transnational. It's, a country may have nothing to do with this, but their shipping is going to be interrupted. Oil prices may be affected. And so they're part of a global economy, and they're affected by these transnational disruptions. Then there's national security risks, and these are, of course, becoming, again, extremely important, rising up to the top of first letter importance. This is one of the things I've been talking to people a lot about here is electric vehicles and Europe's both export potential and importing of EVs. One of the questions that comes up with EVs is there a national security concern when we import an EV? What does that mean for people who are sourcing for the auto companies and making decisions on where to buy the electronics? Now, this has been in the papers lately because China has restricted where certain Teslas can drive inside Beijing. They don't want Teslas inside certain government facilities or state-owned facilities because they see that the amount of information that is created could be a security risk. Is it? With data localization? I don't know. Is that acceptable? Is that not acceptable? Will Chinese EVs be here? Will they be in the United States? These are all important questions. If you are, say, working for Ford Motor Company or for Mercedes, and you are deciding where to build factories, you're going to be making decisions that last 20 years. So you have a lot to think about. And then last, there's concerns about economic coercion. So we see that China retaliating against Lithuania, when Lithuania allowed the opening of use of the word Taiwan as opposed to the preferred name by China. We see the US and the EU have joined together to do economic sanctions on Russia. So these are all, we can think of them as economic coercion, economic sanctions. They may be the good guys, they may be people we don't like, but it doesn't matter. All of them say that we can have what's called weaponized interdependence, and that's the name of a very famous book that came out recently, Weaponized Interdependence. And you, as the supply chain manager, you have to be thinking about those risks as you're making these investments and procurement decisions. So, whoops, sorry, I think I went the wrong way. Okay, here we go. Now, what about resilience? What is resilience? Your boss may say, I want a resilient supply chain. People say, they demand of their politicians, we want resilience, but no one has yet defined it. And for the economists, that makes it very difficult. We can optimize something when we know what it is we're optimizing. What is your objective function, as we would say? What is the objective function? The truth is the world hasn't figured it out. Partly because risks come from so many different ways. They may be weather shocks, which are random, perhaps, or they may be coordinated weather shocks through climate change that we can already foresee. So there's some sense that, well, we'll know it when we see it. In other words, that people have not spent a lot of time on trying to think about what are the key risks and what are we trying to guard against. And I think, at least at the level of politicians and government officials, this is a really first level need. This is where we need to think. You sitting in individual corporations or even in government, that's something you need to think about. What are the most important risks and how can I begin to get some insurance against them? What types of shocks are most likely? And where are they going to emanate from? Clearly, there are some we will just simply will not anticipate. People will say, well, we should have known the pandemic was coming. Really? Do we really? That was sort of, for me, total curveball, right? I remember when it was early 2020 and our IT guy came to me and said that I had to go home and I had to use my computer and work from home the next day. I couldn't come to the office. And I said, why? And he said, well, there's a good chance that we're going to be out of the office because of this new flu that's coming from China. And I said, for how long? And he said, oh, 3 weeks. It was almost a year, right? So could we have foreseen that? I would argue not. But again, there are some shocks that you can't foresee, but there are others that you can. We know now, right? People are talking about microbial resistance. So we know that we could be vulnerable to other shocks. What do you think about that? How do you deal with that? So the other thing we have to think about is that as we respond to these shocks for ourselves and buy insurance for ourselves, we influence others, other countries. And our behavior may by itself become a new source of instability for others. One example, which I'll talk about a little bit, is the US Inflation Reduction Act. We finally, in the US, are seriously addressing climate change. This is very important for the United States. But it's had secondary effects on Europe, which the Europeans have been very vocal about and made clear, just as it's had effects on the Japanese and the South Koreans. Has it been a source of instability for others? The answer is yes, it has. And so thinking through the consequences of the choices that we make is also important in a globalized, interconnected world. Finally, I just want to say resilience for whom? We're very busy. We want to create resilience for our own countries, for our own families, for ourselves. But there's a lot of countries out there who are not as rich as we are, and they are on the front line, particularly in climate change. But also, in many others, they're caught between on the geopolitical tensions between the US and China. It's important that we think about them as well because many of them, many people, and many potentially fast-growing economies. So we want to always be cognizant of the fact that many countries don't have the resources that we have to begin to protect ourselves. This came to the fore in terms of the vaccines, right? How could we begin to roll out vaccines to the developing world? We tried. We didn't do everything right, but we saw what the problems were, and hopefully we can do it better next time. Okay, why and how do we want to increase resilience? Well, why is this such a problem now? It isn't like shocks didn't come before. We had wars, we had pestilence, we had public health issues. Well, first I think is, of course, we've had some natural shocks. First, the pandemic, which was a huge wake-up call for just about everybody. And then, of course, the increasing realization of what climate change can do and what kinds of shocks can come, such that we have countries telling us, if you don't do something, we will not exist in 40 years. So we see these shocks coming. I would also say that we have anxiety about dependence for new technologies. So everyone can see the coming AI revolution, for example, what it might do. There's a lot of anxiety among voters, among politicians, among companies. How do I use AI for good? Can it be hacked? What can happen that's bad? In Europe, I think there's an anxiety about an inability to create their own tech, to capture the benefits of creating this tech and controlling these sources for its own growth and in its own way. Europe has been a leader in regulating tech, but there's still a lot to do, and it would like to also create tech. Why? Because it's going to be an enormous source of wealth. Just as fragmentation and globalization was an enormous source of wealth through the creation of global value chains and the types of products that we were able to use and adapt into our economy, we know that AI is going to hopefully do the same in a positive way. And last, of course, national security risks that are emanating from and being addressed through commerce. So we have, of course, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and the response to that from the West, very quick, very united, probably the best use of the Trade and Technology Council, where those lines of communication worked in this case to immediately place sanctions on Russia. There's been a lot of problems with the sanctions, but nevertheless, it's been an incredibly impressive coordinated effort by many countries. This is, integration is the way that we're able to exert this influence, but it's also itself a source of risk. So we have export controls, sanctions, investment controls, transactional tariffs. These are all things that we can deploy. But they can also be used against us, as we've seen in the case of Lithuania or in other cases like Australia. There are many cases here where export bans have been used to punish behavior that one state doesn't like against another state. Okay, which supply chains has the United States prioritized? So now I'd like to talk a little bit about U.S. priorities. First, the U.S. has perceived that there's been a hollowing out of domestic manufacturing and an inability of the U.S. to self-insure in critical sectors. So this came, I think, to the fore during the pandemic when we ran out of personal protective equipment for doctors, masks, gloves, paper goods, and Americans are asking, hey, these are not high-tech goods. Why can't we supply these? Why can't we create these basic supplies for our own people? We don't manufacture them anymore. So that, coupled with the belief that the hollowing out of manufacturing has made the society more unequal, both in the income distribution and across space, spatially, where there's towns and villages that have been left behind. This is not an unfamiliar idea in Europe, which has had regional adjustment policies for years, and that has led to increasing political polarization and dysfunction. So a lot has been kind of loaded onto this view about the hollowing out of manufacturing. Second is the failure of the U.S. to begin the energy transition and address the domestic disruptions that the energy transition would cause. So realization, at least in the Biden administration, that climate change is coming, we're behind, we need to do something to jumpstart this adaptation. Also the recognition that this is going to have seismic influences on the auto industry, energy industry, mining, other types of industries, workers that are attached to those industries whose human capital in those industries could disappear. So a belief that this is something that is coming and is going to be of such significance that it needs to be addressed at the federal level. And last, an increasing understanding that there's an imperative to reduce dependence on China, especially in tech. And we can look at how we view China, whether friend or foe, and I've spent much of my career studying China. But if we just look strictly at the trade flows, we can see that trade is heavily concentrated in East Asia. Advanced chips, 90% are coming from one small beautiful island. And so you might look at that objectively and say, hey, that's kind of nuts. if for no other reason than it poses an enormous set of risks, geopolitical, weather-related, just idiosyncratic shocks. And we need to make sure that we diversify our trade. This is what Ursula von der Leyen from the European presidency will call de-risking. De-risking is her word for it. We need to de-risk. And that almost always translates into diversifying. Now, you as a supply chain manager will say, diversification is costly. I have to have 2 plants, 2 sources, 2 relationships. One is better than the other. Why 2? 2 is an insurance policy. 3, maybe. How many? I don't know. This is going to be up to you. I would add one other, which I haven't put on the slide, which is the desire for people to believe that global trade is fair. And that means that we're concerned about human rights, as well as fair policies. So workers in all of our countries may experience import competition, and we have said, hey, that's the way the world is. You know, this is what a free and capitalist-based system does. Entry of new firms, that keeps the economy growing. That's our secret, elixir. But it also means that the people who lose their jobs have to feel that they're competing fairly. And I think we have spoken. We don't want child labor. We don't want forced labor. We would like to see an improvement in environmental. For example, EU, Europe has been a leader in voicing concerns about human rights and voicing concerns about climate. For example, you have the CBAM, the Climate Border Adjustment Mechanism, coming, saying we're going to clean up our act, and we expect the people who sell us things are also going to clean up their act. So these are more objectives that are loaded onto your job of determining a resilient supply chain. So resilience, I think, is a word that we use to cover a lot of objectives. Okay, strategies to enhance resilience, de-risking, if we use the European term. One is home shoring, or what we call in the United States reshoring. And this is self-insurance, and it's based on the belief that only the domestic control of supply will enhance security. Now, of course, it ignores domestic shocks. We in the United States has an interesting case with baby formula, obviously an essential good. It turns out that baby formula comes in many, many varieties, some of which are essential to the life and health of infants. We had a plant taken down because of regulatory problems. The plant was producing tainted formula, or was it suspected of producing tainted formula? And there were thousands of families in America who couldn't get the baby formula that they needed for their infants. Major political problem. Well, why don't we just import some from Europe? It's, high standard, high regulatory society. I think we can trust the baby food. Answer, we don't have any trade. It's a highly regulated industry. The industry is dominated by a few players who have decided that a segmented market is okay for them. Different labeling, different standards, different formulas. I remember when I brought my own infant to Europe, when we went to Spain, my daughter would not, I'm sorry to say this, she would not take Spanish formula. Love the German. I have no idea. I suspect they might use more sugar. But, so you have individual things that led to a very fragmented market. So my own point here is that completely domestic control of the supply chain does not always ensure resilience. Trade is an important factor toward resilience. The question is, how do we organize those trade relationships? The second strategy that the Biden administration is using is friendshoring, or what we might call in Europe open clubs. This is like group insurance. It's the ability to create product and process standards. So, for example, you have a group that agrees to high labor standards or high environmental standards. It's what we're trying to do with the critical minerals agreement between the U.S. and Europe. What we're trying to do with a green steel and aluminum agreement. So there are nascent negotiations underway to try to create this kind of club. In terms of friendshoring, the U.S. has, of course, its partners under the USMCA, so Mexico and Canada within the Free Trade Agreement of North America. But we also have been reaching out into the Indo-Pacific to create friendshoring there, where countries will agree to share information that provides some kind of monitoring of risks and begins to create higher standards. It's very difficult. So far, we only have agreement on a few things. It's been very limited, much to the disappointment of many economists who would like to see a more robust agreement. But nevertheless, these processes are underway. The last is just trade and investment exclusion. The US is also using this, particularly against China, Russia. This is insurance against risks emanating from what are termed untrusted partners. So the US, for example, is working to remove Chinese critical minerals from its supply chains for EV. And this is something that is forcing a kind of global fracture or global fragmentation, where U.S. supply chains will begin to move away from other types of supply chains. And that adds another layer for you, which is where your product's going. Not just let me make them with high process and product standards, but now I have to also consider where they're going to meet. You already probably do because you have different regulatory standards, but now we're going to add something very different on top. All of these strategies raise costs from today's baseline in a world where people absolutely hate inflation. It's why they often say, what's your problem? Oh, food prices are too high, or this is too high, or they're going up too fast. So you're being asked to do so much more for the same cost, but it's just not possible. You're going to have to make double the investments or triple the investments and create so much more time just to certify. Certifying goods, that goods are not made or don't come, for example, from the Xinjiang region, under legislation in the United States has led to, whole bureaucracies having to be created, not only in the government, but individual firms to certify that products are not made with forced labor. Okay, so this is just a quick look at how the Biden administration is doing this. I have here some characteristics of the different approaches: homeshoring or reshoring, friendshoring, and decoupling from China. The U.S. has decided not to use the word decoupling or use the word de-risking, but in fact, in my view, it is a form of decoupling. It's selective decoupling. The U.S. has been in conversation, thank goodness, ever since the meeting between President Xi and President Biden. The U.S. and China are now in much more active set of communication and discussion. And the U.S. has been trying to say, look, we need to decouple or reduce our integration with your economy in these areas. China doesn't see it that way. It sees it as a hostile act, which it has been very clear, saying it sees as an attempt to reduce its rate of development. So I call it China decoupling. Now, what are the policy initiatives? Under homeshoring, we have the CHIPS Act, which is going to bring a lot of semiconductor manufacturers to the United States, as well as associated activities like packaging and testing. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is obviously misnamed. It's really about the creation of new energy suppliers and materials inside the United States and inside North America. What kind of tools are we using? We're using direct subsidies, producer subsidies, user-side subsidies, domestic content requirements, and, of course, tax incentives for companies to invest in the United States. The effectiveness I left as high, and I'll explain in a minute why, but the cost is also high. These two bills alone are enormously costly for the U.S. Treasury, and we could possibly see some rollback depending on what happens in the upcoming presidential election, because there are other things that are going to be priorities for a Republican administration, most namely tax cuts, continuing tax cuts. These are things that cost money for the Treasury. So there's a limit to how many of these. People may say, oh, the U.S. is doing industrial policy, where will it end? And I'll tell you, it's going to end because industrial policy is very costly. And the United States government doesn't have the endless amounts of ways to funnel resources from taxpayers or citizens to companies the way that some other countries might. On friendshoring, the U.S. has pursued the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Green Steel and Aluminum Agreement, and Critical Mineral Agreement, among others. The tools are to try to negotiate a set of common standards cross-border investment, facilitation, and procurement clubs, among others. The effectiveness so far has been low. We haven't gotten agreements on these, even with our closest partner, the European Union. So the cost so far has also been low because not much has been on the table besides kind of nice words about what we intend to do. In terms of China decoupling, we have the Trump-era trade war tariffs. Tariffs on China remain at an average of about 20% in the United States, and that clearly did lead to some decoupling, and that firms responded to that by shifting where they supply. There's been an enormous amount of rerouting, as well as, so you take a factory in China, you move some of the equipment to Vietnam, say, and Vietnam, say, sews apparel or snaps together the cell phone, with a lot of the content continuing to come from China. Nevertheless, in the trade statistics, you'll see that as a big decrease in the amount of cell phones that are coming from China. It's happened for South Korea. Samsung now produces its cell phones in Vietnam and not in China at all, but that was predating the trade war. Then, of course, the foreign entities of concern, I have an FEOC up there, provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act mean that the U.S. Over time will reduce the share of critical minerals that can come from China. How do we do this? Differential tariffs. Obviously, the U.S. trade war on China violated WTO rules. It says we're going to have most favored nation for all partners except you. We use export controls. We may also use just exclusions. You're not part of this. The effectiveness I put as moderate because when you use taxes, you do move flows. And the cost, though, has also been moderate in the sense that we now know from study after study, both in the United States and in China, which retaliated with its own tariffs, that those tariffs are borne by the country's own importers. So, and that may be businesses that use those intermediate inputs, because a lot of trade, as you well know, is in capital goods and intermediate goods, but also final good consumers. So people who buy shoes and boots, which are basically come to our shore, toys, they're finished when they get here. And those studies after studies have shown that the pass-through, quote unquote, of tariffs to consumers and users is about 100%. Here's just a quick picture that I took, that is from last summer, about where new plants have been announced in the United States for semiconductor equipment and materials. Obviously, there was some pre-gaming here because people knew that this bill was going to pass, or they expected it to pass, and we're already making announcements. Announcements don't mean you have to put any money in the ground yet, so there were a lot of announcements before the act even passed. This is, of course, something that other countries look at and shudder a little bit. Americans might look at it and say, rah, because we get all this new investment, but our trading partners will look and see the giant sucking sound of America. That is, U.S. is an attractive place. Why? Well, they're going to get huge subsidies. What about the output from these companies, you might ask? Aren't they going to be very high priced? The answer is yes. We haven't really dealt with that issue yet. Or, as I like to think in my head, when government creates supply, who creates demand? A lot of times the answer there is also government. So on EVs, it may be through user subsidies, which I believe you had here in Europe as well as in the United States. We now have subsidies for adopting a battery electric vehicle. But it also will come to pass through protection. People don't see protection as a type of market creation for domestic companies, but it is, of course, because it gives them a margin where they can charge or have higher costs. So it increases domestic sales of the good. Friendshoring and nearshoring. The best example is the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where the U.S. very explicitly set out to create a group of friends who would adhere to certain high standards in labor and environment. But there are others. As I said, the restrictions contained in the IRA for critical minerals. This is something that you're going to hear more of, because in the legislation, the amount of critical minerals which have to come from countries with whom the United States has either a free trade agreement or a critical mineral agreement increases very rapidly to 2030. And at right now, we're not on track to be able to, the auto companies in the US are not on track to be able to meet that sourcing. As you know, many critical minerals are dominated or have high content of Chinese investment and supply in them. And China has been listed as a foreign entity of concern. So how are companies going to deal with this? I had a company that is dealing with silicon. They're trying to get Chinese silicon out of their supply chain. They are under duress to do so. They want to be completely compliant, but they just simply cannot find enough alternative sources. So this is a mandate that's been placed on businesses at a time when they're really, at this point, not able to control this supply chain. If you are, say, a company that does aftermarket work on solar panels, you don't actually control a silicon mine. So, this is something that you are dependent on a community, the types of group action that's needed to create new sources of minerals which are highly concentrated or under the control. Remember we said, however you think about it, diversification seems to be an important part of creating resilience. Reducing dependence on China is a very American I would say imperative, but it has meaning for many, many countries who see the concentration of supply in China as something that raises risks that they would like to reduce. So Trump-era trade wars remain in place, and these have reduced American purchases of those goods that were taxed. We'll see what happened to other goods in a minute. The U.S. is using producer and user subsidies to exclude China as a supplier in the new energy area. They want that industry to be North American. We have done some things to make sure that the Europeans, for example, the South Koreans, the Japanese, can also sell vehicles. That's a complicated set of regulatory rules that could be undone depending on the election coming up, but we have nice publications on that from the Peterson Institute if you're interested in learning more about the IRA and its complicated rules. Export controls are another way that we are seeking to reduce our dependence on China. It is something that is also helping to move the semiconductor industry away from China because of limits, not just on the flow of American technology, but through what's called the forward product rule, also reducing the ability of European countries to sell equipment to Chinese manufacturers. So the U.S., the long arm of the United States, is evident here. It has, for example, reduced the ability of ASML, which is important company in the Netherlands, from selling their advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. It's not just NVIDIA and gaming chips and other kinds of GPUs. It's also the equipment, software, other types of services that go with it. So this has had an enormous influence on this particular industry. So far, we haven't seen a strong Chinese reaction, but we could, and many of these companies are concerned about their sales to what they have viewed as an important market, which is China. All of this has caused increased uncertainty for companies who are involved in global sourcing, and those if we look at trade, it's heavily skewed toward large companies. We can think of the largest companies, as you know, they're import and export. Then we have many companies who just import. Oftentimes they're just importing intermediates. And then we have a group of companies, usually your small and medium size, particularly your small enterprises, that are not doing either. And we also know that productivity rises along the scale. So your larger, more globally active companies also tend to be your most productive, most innovative. They hold most patents. So these flows are highly important to the health of our industry, to industries, to our economy, to innovation. And all of these concerns, demands on companies is increasing the uncertainties that they face. Uncertainty is one thing that corporations really don't like. It makes these types of sourcing and investment decisions much more difficult. We are starting to see how the world is beginning to take shape. We may not always like it, but we can face it and start to think about how, as a company or a supply chain manager, you can respond. Having said that, I say it's not over yet. Okay, this is a chart that shows you what happened to U.S. imports when we put on to 25% tariffs. Those are high tariffs, right? And they were on 60% of the bundle that we were initially importing from China. And what you see here is the goods are divided into three. The gray is goods on which there was no tariff, no trade war tariff placed. The pink are what are called lists 1, 2, and 3. Those received 25% tariffs. And the dark red, which received 7.5% tariffs. That was mostly consumer goods. President Trump, former President Trump at the time, decided in the end to cut the tariff to 7.5, mainly because those were things that he thought would hit voters the hardest. Of course, we know taxes on intermediate goods also find their way to consumers. But what you can see is that the trade war took place in 2018, 2019, and that you had a big decrease initially in the importation of goods that were hit with tariffs. You can see it in the reduction in the size of the pink and the dark red portions of those bars. Over time, though, we still have increases in the amount of trade we do with China. So it's the strong pull of Chinese comparative advantage and expertise. So this is not a total answer, but it has had an effect, and it's been paid for by the American public. When we look at other things, let me just see if I have, no, okay. I was going to say one other thing about this, but I'll come to it later. Okay, now this begins to hint at the fact that there's traction in the wheels, that governments have a lot of desire to increase resilience. They still need a lot of work in thinking about what they mean by that, how they're going to do that, what tools they're going to do, how much coordination they're going to do with businesses. But there's just some things that are just going to be a fact of life that we're going to have to deal with. One of them is that reshoring, even in particular industries, semiconductors, new energy products, puts your own country first, but it hurts your allies, it hurts your friends. And we have heard this loud and clear from Europe as well as from other parts of Asia. Domestic content, which says that a good has to, contain a certain share of North American or even American content, discriminates against your domestic partners, not your domestic partners, your partner's exports, and it is non-compliant with WTO. So it's a direct refutation of everything that we spent the last 60 years building. And it's just, it's just a complete change from all the way the trajectory that the world had before. Now, it's really clear why they're there. They're there because populations that are undergoing these transitions and shocks want to know what's in it for me. And politicians make sure that production will happen at home because that's essential to building the kind of support that's needed. In the United States, through the IRA, this has been essential for building political support for the United States to face up to the climate challenge. And my friends who are more on the green side will say, what do we need? We need to maintain democracy, and we need to face the energy transition, and you're worried about WTO rules. Now, of course, that's not entirely true. I tried to tell them a coordinated response could produce a better outcome where we coordinate this with the European Union. The European Union has chosen to use user subsidies but does not discriminate on the source of the vehicle. That has been consistent with its open stance, its support of the world trading system. And in some sense, it's been the strongest voice for an open trading system, rules-based trading system. I think Europeans should be very proud of that. On the other hand, you're facing increasing competition and your own transition in the industry, which is going to make that stance more and more difficult for politicians in Europe. Of course, we know that subsidies pull in investment, so it's not just about trade flows, it's also about investment, it's also about where are these industries of the future going to be located. And here you can imagine that we haven't even really gotten to square zero on cooperation and coordination across friends even, right? And this has led to a great deal of concern, particularly within the European Union, where they see that only a few of the member states will be able to have the scale available to offer subsidies that will pull in global companies and compete successfully with US states for investment in batteries, in semiconductors, in wind turbines, in hydrogen. So there's a lot here on the line as we think about this type of competition. Not a lot of thought yet into what a coordinated, cooperative equilibrium could look like. Another concern that I have is that reshoring or domestic content restrictions really limit competition. Domestic sectors may like it because then they don't have to compete with foreign companies, but we know what competition does. It lowers costs and it improves the innovation. Now, you may say there's limits to that, but it has been shown time and time again that competition is healthy, and in a healthy competition is healthy, and that when we protect industries, they tend to grow flabby. And we don't want to have our major corporations be flabby, because these are the industries that we're protecting are industries of the future. In other words, they're industries in which we see that there's enormous potential for innovation. So we have to continue to engender that incentive for innovation. You can't just create the next semiconductor and say, well, I'm done, and let me just live on those rents. No, you have to be hungry and create the next. So this is a problem. It's one that instead of, while we're doing things to make sure that we have the capacity to remain at the technological frontier, we could be setting ourselves up to move to the back of the line. That's a concern I have. Another concern is that as we look at diversification, we see that at least for the US, when it looks at its partners in the Indo-Pacific, most of them are not decreasing their integration with China, they're increasing their integration with China. So this graph that we did on the side shows you imports, which are the blue bars, and exports, which are the red bars. And you see that the United States between 2010 and 2021 actually decreased the share of imports that were coming from China and increased the share of its exports that were going to China. But most countries were in the Indo-Pacific were experiencing the opposite. In other words, their import dependence on China was going up. So you see all those blue bars, and most of them are going up. The exception is Japan, and more recently South Korea. And tiny, was it, no, I guess Fiji's also, oh yeah, Brunei is not very high, but it's experienced a big increase in exports for a variety of reasons. But what you see here is, look at Vietnam. It goes from 30 to 43%. And that is, of course, one of our key hopes for moving supply chains and still being able to take advantage of the benefits of fragmentation and producing some parts of the supply chain in locations that are labor abundant and therefore have lower costs. So that's a constraint. The second constraint is something that I talk about in the United States all the time, which is that no matter how much Americans put their hands over their face, China's not going anywhere. And in fact, if we look at this just simple bar chart that I made, you can see that China's share of world manufactured exports is now 28%. Now this is measured treating all intra-European trade as intra and not international trade. So EU is here counted as one. If we take that out, or we treat, movements between France and Germany as international trade, China still is close to 18% of global manufactured trade. It just is not going anywhere. And so what is a strategy that increases resilience, increases security, but still allows a role for China? If we don't answer that question, we will find out that we have a fragmented world where we have connections that we are non-transparent. In other words, instead of making supply chains shorter, more transparent, more secure, we'll make them longer, less transparent, less secure. So that's one thing that I think is important. Here's a new chart that I'm working on, looking at import concentration indexes. So these are simple Herfindahl indexes, so sums of squares. And what we see is that China, the bar is going down. China has been reducing its import competition. Its Herfindahl index is going down. It has increased its reliance on the European Union and decreased it on Japan and Korea. The United States, its import concentration rose between 2012 and 2017, but by 2022 it had fallen a lot, and a lot of that was reduced reliance on China. For the European Union, it's going in the other direction. Its import concentration is going up, and most of that is due to increasing reliance on China. Now we're trying to update the 2023 numbers for the European Union are just coming out, and we'll look. That 2022 was still influenced by pandemic and pharma-related flows, but a lot of my European friends are very interested to see what will happen, particularly in EVs. So we see we're making some gains. China, for its own national security, has been diversifying. US is now diversifying. Europe seems to be going in the other direction. For manufacturers or for manufacturers' representatives or for those who run the supply chains, looking for alternatives, places to locate the more labor-intensive part of the supply chain is complicated, because this graph shows you the 2010 global export share and the 2019 export share. If they stay the same, it's going to be right on that diagonal line there. And what we see is that only a few countries are able to really increase their share of global manufactured goods. Most of those are in East Asia. In other words, they're highly integrated with China and part of the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership. Okay, where do we go from here? Some challenges, and I'll be really quick so we have time to talk. Multilateral. Where are we going to get leadership to help us do the coordination that I seem to think is needed? Who is going to lead us? Secondly, just our bilateral relationship. Only coordination can reduce the frictions, and yet we know how difficult coordination is. The IRA was written by Congress in the middle of the night. You're going to have a new parliament. You have a complicated, complex political system. How is coordination between these two close friends going to happen? Nationally, the U.S. needs a supply strategy that is part of a China strategy, and so far the U.S. has been groping for the China strategy. It doesn't have a China strategy that is overarching. We hear that we're not decoupling. Our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has been very articulate in saying that we are not decoupling from China. That would be, she uses two words, impossible or infeasible, and destabilizing. I believe she's right. But what is the China policy? We're still trying to see. And that's clearly an important part of how we redesign supply chains. Lastly, for firms, fragmenting operations to reduce risk. Firms are already responding. It's hard to track this because it's happening in real time. We had the whole pandemic shock that kind of messed everything up, and now we're trying to see what is the so-called new normal. And we hear a lot, we're in China for China, so companies that are operating in China are not leaving China mostly, but are they placing new investments? There are some signs that firms are repatriating profits that they earn in China from China. Foreign direct investment into China has fallen dramatically in the last 12 months. So in China, for China, but more in China, question mark. Firms are increasingly walling off their Chinese operations. So we have, for example, even in services, law firms selling their Chinese operations and creating wholly different entities. Why? Not only what's happening in the West, but what's happening inside China with its own cybersecurity laws, laws on information flows, where information can't flow from your Chinese affiliate to your home. So increasingly, companies are fragmenting across borders. Multinationals are making more and deeper investments outside China. They're pushed by geopolitical tensions between the US and China. They're pushed by rising costs inside China. China's wages have been going up. Chinese entrepreneurs have been incredibly adept at squeezing more and more out of their productive processes while paying higher and higher wages and meeting higher and more stringent environmental costs. But that process has a certain limit in certain industries, particularly labor-intensive things like apparel and textiles. And they're pushed by greater risks in China that are coming from new regulations within China itself, regulations that aren't entirely clear as to how they will be implemented, such as the new cybersecurity laws. And lastly, they're being pulled into new locations because new locations have gotten their act together. So we see a place like Vietnam, which has spent the last 20 years building new infrastructure, sending students abroad who are now repatriating, bringing the type of human capital that's needed to take advantage of what is a largely literate workforce. So there are other countries here that are clearly beginning to become more attractive. India, start, stop, but nevertheless is on everybody's list of places to consider for new investment. So you will be someday in a manager level, I think, in one of these corporations, or perhaps you'll choose public service, and these questions will be on your desk. And the question, where will you be? How can we begin to answer them? I don't know. I just think that cooperation has to be part of the answer. We have to look for a new stable equilibrium. And that is going to take all of the goodwill, intelligence, and fortitude that each of us can muster. Thank you. Yes, please.
Just from the last thing here.
Oh, microphone.
Yes. Perfect. You spoke in the end about where these supply chains should be because you're moving away from China, and Southeast Asia is a lot about child labor and bad working environment. We learned from Joan that China also gives a lot of African countries huge loans, but with collateral that infects infrastructure, land, businesses. We also talked about Mercosur, and they had to try to negotiate a trade agreement with EU since '99, but it's still not ratified. So my question to you is, where will these, because you want to move supply chains away from China, but where will these be? Thank you.
Okay, so look into my crystal ball. We are seeing supply chains move to other parts of Southeast Asia. The Asia trade is really booming. And that is reflecting of this Asian production network, which has always been there, but is growing and is deepening. So I think that Southeast Asia will remain on the list. Part of IPEF is to discuss increases in labor standards, for example. And that is something that Western powers are beginning to say, well, we can use our market power to force this issue. But we also have to offer them something. And we are not offering them very much right now. That's part of the problem, why we're not getting any traction. The U.S. is not offering any market access. We already have low tariffs, we say, so we don't need it, but there's lots of areas where we could negotiate with them, but we haven't. Why? Because there is really no political support for more openness within the domestic economy. So domestic political economy is constraining what can be done in the international sphere. And this is a very real constraint. It's one that politicians can't afford to ignore. If they do, someone who is less open to international exchange will take their place, right? We're seeing the rise of populism and far-right parties all over the world. So it's a real big problem. Investment, yes, they want investment. We are now seeing the U.S. is stalled in terms of aid for small countries in the Pacific. They have been very clear saying, China's ready to sign. Where are you? It's stuck in Congress. We don't care. So, and if I were leading a country in Micronesia, that's what I'd be saying. Show me the money. So Democratic countries have to step up. The problem is there is not much political support for that. It's not a happy story at the moment. I don't have any magic wand, but we need a creative, inspirational leadership to get that done. Sometimes horrible things force actors to come together. Unfortunately, let's hope that's not required, right? And another question? Anybody brave enough? Yeah. I think they want you to use the microphone.
From the U.S. perspective, do you think that the CHIPS Act is more of like a home shoring or de-risking technique? Because they're trying to bring the manufacturing to the U.S. because of obviously the supply chain, but the threat of China invading Taiwan. But then they're also trying to boost domestic manufacturing. Or do you see it maybe as a little bit of both?
Oh, it's absolutely both. I mean, in terms of reducing risk, would be okay if the chip factory was in Spain? The answer to my mind would be yes, right? But that is not going to give Congress the reason for spending billions and billions of taxpayers' dollars. Where I spent most of my career in Syracuse, New York, may receive a Micron investment. It hasn't been awarded funding yet, but it could bring anywhere from 9,000 to 25,000 jobs. So that is something that gets voters' attention. And yes, it's both. It's domestic content and industrial policy subsidies have been the answer to the political problem. So we are trading off some of our globalization views or aspirations or values to get certain things done that we are now prioritizing. In the United States, it is what is viewed as national security, but also beginning to address climate change, both of which can be viewed as, by some, as existential risks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. There was so much there that I'm not quite sure how to focus a question, but I shall try. I'm focusing on your point about cooperation being the answer. And in terms of EU-US relations, I was really taken by your slide on US policy. I wonder if you'd be able to put
Which
that
one
up for a
on
the table with the different 12 users. That one, yeah, because I mean, for two reasons. I mean, the first reason that I was really taken was the similarity between the debate that you're putting and the debate in the EU. I mean, right down to CHIPS Act and Green Act and the priorities. So all of that was very clear. But what I found a bit scary was that you're saying that the most effective policy we found so far is home shoring, which has a high effectiveness, but is precisely seems to be the thing that's least friendly to a trading system. And also say with the China decoupling, you're getting problems with WTO rules there. So is the lesson that we seem to be drawing that we are moving towards a protectionist system because there's nothing else we can come up with? That's something I find a bit scary. And in terms of how the EU and the US are dealing and whether we can find this cooperation, I mean, from what I hear from EU trade people, I mean, there are certain points in friction with EU and the US which are just normal and taken as zero. So Boeing, all of that, okay, we will find a solution. The IRA was taken very badly as extremely disappointing. The US didn't take that into account, so it was taken as disappointing. And the steel tariffs were taken as something that really scared people, that it was a game changer because of the basis that the steel tariffs were put in. That this was going different, taking us to a different place. So my question, I suppose, would be to avoid the conclusion that the most anti-trade things are the most effective. What should the EU governments do to try and persuade the US that there's an opening, and what could the US governments do to try and persuade the EU that there's an opening? Was there anything more we could do?
Okay, thank you for the question. I want to say on effectiveness, it's really in terms of meeting a particular goal. Here it's just moving stuff back to the US. It's so far it looks like it is going to be effective. In terms of what can be done to try to engender some cooperation and coordination, I think there are certain natural stopping points. You're not going to see more big acts coming out of the US. And I say this, let's say we have a Biden administration after November, then there are going to be opportunities for some cooperation. The Biden administration, for example, has allowed vehicles that are fully made in the EU to count toward the user's subsidy on EVs, which can be as much as $7,500 through regulations that are written by the Treasury. If we have a Trump administration, that will go away almost surely. So, you have an election coming up. We have an election coming up, and there's a lot on the line in terms of cooperation, but it can be done because there are limits to what can be done here. Friendshoring really isn't getting any traction. It's a lot of nice words. In terms of China decoupling, yeah, U.S. maybe, but look, I showed you, trade's going up with China in the U.S., and China has maintained and even increased its share of global manufacturers. That's why I say we need a China strategy. It's not going away. So there are these traction in the wheels, I called it, but it's just natural constraints that are going to say, hey, maybe we should try cooperation. We'll have a bigger market. We'll have bigger procurement. We can coordinate investment. We have developing countries that want investment. We could coordinate there. There's a lot of opportunities that have come up. Some people have praised, sort of competitive, if we all rush to provide green financing, for example. That still has to happen within, I think, a coordinated framework. So there's a lot of new ways to cooperate we haven't thought about. The question always is, are they politically feasible? And there, I think we have had to pull back on some of our integration. As much as I've enjoyed the last 30 years and certainly made my career in it, we're seeing the necessity to pull back in some ways and to try to do it in a way that does actually enhance resilience and not impinge on costs too much, because they still matter. Just a case in point, EVs. The EU now is considering its investigation on Chinese subsidies on EVs. The US is very unlikely to import Chinese EVs at any point, although there are movements for Chinese manufacturers to invest in Mexico. China's going to produce perfectly beautiful vehicles that are going to be low cost. We have a need to provide these vehicles to low-income households. It's not going to be a Mercedes, and it's not going to be a BMW, all of which I saw in your beautiful gleaming airports. So, there are multiple objectives here, which will, I think, begin to force some cooperation. I guess my answer is we'll do it when there's no other choice.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for your speech. So as we know, that not only the United States, but also China is trying to decoupling with the foreign capital. For example, based on its Made in China 2025 policy, which indicates that China's government is trying to create an internal circulation of its due circulation. And my question is, do you think that the United States is also trying to build this kind of internal circulation of economy, or trying to remain the economy from international perspective?
Okay, so the U.S. is not trying to mimic dual circulation. I think China has unique issues with fragmentation within its economy that are not shared by the United States. So what we're trying to do is get more domestic production. Now, there are a few examples that differ. For example, recycling is something that all of us would like to do, sort of a closed circuit on that, and that's different when we look at particular issues, but as a macro policy, no. We also see challenges in China's attempts, but slow progress toward the development of the internal market, and that is concerns about weak domestic demand and using net exports or exports to as a outlet for surplus. Now, by definition, exports are surplus, right? They're stuff you don't use internally and you sell abroad. You know, the world has really benefited from China's growth in exporting. But right now, as you probably have read this week, we have had 2 of our deputy secretaries of the Treasury in China, thankfully beginning to talk with their counterparts. And both of them were issuing concerns about China's domestic demand and the growth in Chinese surplus that will be exported. It's something that also is of great concern to Europe, particularly with the very rapid growth in China's EV exports. So, you know, it's one thing when China exports a lot of shoes. It's another when we're all vying for the same sectors, right? And the West experienced this with solar panels and was pretty late to catch on to what was happening. I don't think that's going to, I think they're much more aware and on the ball this time with EVs. So there is definitely some concerns ahead. I think that even at the highest levels, President Xi has discussed the need for orderly expansion of exports. So the Chinese are aware of these issues. But you know, these decisions are being made by hundreds of individual suppliers and buyers, and so we could see more trade friction coming up as a result of this. That is dual circulation really not progressing at the speed that's necessary. I guess, are we out of one more question? Is that good?
And thank you for the quite interesting speech. I do have a question prepared for you, and it's that when looking at global supply chains, there are many variables that are intricately connected amongst themselves and to a multitude of government departments of other countries. So is there a process for determining which elements of the global supply chain are the responsibility of specific players, whether those be companies, countries, or organizations?
Well, you know, since the beginning of the World Trade Organization, even before in the GATT, we've been trying to make your world easier. The trade warriors of the past, you know, trying to do trade facilitation, assist countries in technical support. When I first started my career, there was no single source of trade data, so you couldn't really compare. You know, now, you can just sit in your dorm room, and at the little blink of a finger, you can download at the 6-digit level everybody's imports and exports from, you know, Sepitu, from Paris. They've been all massaged for you. You know, you have it easy, kid. So things have progressed not only in terms of studying and knowledge of other people's tariffs, for example. We had no idea until really the WTO started doing its trade reviews. We are adding new complications, lots of new complications. And we will in the future have to find a way to reduce those complications. But I'm sorry, I think things are going to become more complicated before they become less complicated. And if you want to know whose responsibility it's going to be yours. The supply chain manager is going to come right down there. They're the ones, in the end, you know, governments are saying they're moving to place the onus of, say, enforcement of rules against forced labor. That is going to be responsibility of the company. So I think that's the answer, you.
Take advantage of being the dean to ask a final question. You have been focusing all the time, of course, into things that are the material world. What about the virtual world with all of this? With the artificial intelligence, we are having a boom of this virtual world. How is this changing all our approach to all the issues that you have been talking about?
It's a great question, and it's kind of, right? We've already seen fragmentation, right? China has this great firewall. I was just in China, and I inadvertently got onto the hotel Wi-Fi instead of my LTE, and all of a sudden I couldn't read all my apps didn't work. And I'm like, what happened? So, you already have that. You have, data localization. Countries are just beginning to grapple with regulation of AI. AI, of course, uses enormous amounts of information. It has enormous potential in terms of providing information or misinformation. So I think, China, the European Union, US is slow to regulate. We've been slow to regulate tech in the US, and it's just clearly something that will have to be seen. We have already seen the US pull out of digital trade negotiations through the ESCI-UPF, something that was shocking to many, many people, because the US has been a huge proponent of free flow of commerce through digital portals. But I think it reflects, again, a basic movement within the United States to take a stronger regulatory hand. My own view was nothing in that agreement would have prevented the U.S. from pursuing antitrust case against the big tech, but it was viewed that way by, particularly on the left in the U.S., and therefore the negotiation was paused. So you're seeing both within and between countries conflict over how best to constrain these digital flows at the same time that everybody wants to encourage these digital flows. We have yet to really, I think, investigate and research what the benefits of the flows are. We think of them as all flowing to AWS, Amazon, Google, whoever, but they do have the potential to bring people into the labor force through remote work that we haven't really explored. We have now had this gigantic, experiment in remote work called the pandemic. And I hope that it allows us to bring in disabled people, mothers with children at home, others who have not really benefited from globalization the way many of us have. So it's enormous potential. Governments want to shape things the way that adheres to their own domestic values and cultures. Again, it's an area where we're in desperate need of cooperation, but so far we haven't been able to really get there. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.